In Hegyonei Halacha, which I hope you received on page 159, we have a section about the Daled Kosos, which is always a very exciting topic, at least for me. And the Gemara Psachim with the Rashbam, in the last parak, Arvei Psachim, we have a Rashbam on Daf Kuf Ches points out that we require Hesebah with Daled Kosos. So the Shtia has to be B'derech Hesebah. Hesebah is what we call Derech Cherus. And the Gemara doesn't know exactly which kosos of the four require Hesebah. In fact, the Gemara assumes that only 2 out of the 4 require Hesebah. That's the premise of the Gemara. And then the Gemara vacillates back and forth. Is it the first 2 kosos? Is it the last 2 kosos? And the Gemara gives a svara for each side. The first 2 kosos seem to be more appropriate, says Rav Nachman, because this is the cherus. This is the part in which we discuss the Haggadah, and we talk about cherus, and Hesebah is appropriate for cherus, right? It's an expression of chesed. But when we get to the last 2 kosos, Gemara uses the phrase "Mai dahava hava." You're going backwards now. We've already gone free, and we've been liberated as slaves. It doesn't make sense in the last 2 kosos to do Hesebah. Then the Gemara says another svara, just the opposite, that for the first 2 kosos, it doesn't make sense to do Hesebah. It's only for the last 2 kosos. And the reason for that is because the first 2 kosos start with what we call maschil b'gnus, avodim ayinu lefar b'mitzrayim, and we only really leave Mitzrayim at the end of the second kos when we recite the bracha Kol Yisrael. So once you have already become a ben chora, meaning after the second kos, then it makes sense to do Hesebah. So again, just to summarize, the Gemara vacillates back and forth. The Gemara knew that only 2 out of 4 of the kosos require Hesebah. The Gemara has svara to say it's the first 2 because that's when we're reciting the story of cherus, whereas when we get to the second kosos, it's already Mai dahava hava, it's old hat, we've already been there and done it. The Gemara gives us svara to say, no, it's not appropriate to do Hesebah in the first 2 kosos because avodim ayinu lefar Mitzrayim, we only leave Mitzrayim at the point of the last bracha of Magid, which is Kol Yisrael, and therefore in the last 2 kosos we should be doing Hesebah. So what's the final conclusion? If we don't know whether it's the first 2 or the last 2 that require Hesebah, so the Gemara says that because of this suffix, elu v'elu tu'unim Hesebah, we're going to do Hesebah on all 4 kosos. And that's how it's paskined in the Rosh, in the Rif, in the Rambam, and in the Shulchan Aruch. So it's all in the poskim, the Rishonim, that we do Hesebah on all 4 kosos. And the Ran raises a fundamental question. If we have a suffix, which of the kosos require Hesebah? This should be a suffix d'Rabbanan. And the overriding rule is suffix d'Rabbanan l'kula. Why don't we apply that rule with regard to the kosos? Any kos that I pick up, you want to tell me, well, I'm chayiv in Hesebah. I don't know. Maybe yes, maybe no. So I should say suffix d'Rabbanan l'kula and do away with Hesebah. And the Ran offers 2 approaches. We're going to spend a little time here trying to understand the 2 answers of the Ran. So if I had a whiteboard here, I would put Roman numeral number 1, and that's the first answer of the Ran. And the Ran says that we're not going to apply the principle of suffix d'Rabbanan l'kula in a davar she'ein bo torah. If it's not a big deal, we're not asking you and imposing upon you any sort of tircha. All we're asking you to do is recline while you're drinking the kos. We're not going to apply the principle of suffix d'Rabbanan l'kula. So you pick up any kos, and I'm going to tell you, what do you care? It's not a Torah cuddle. Do Hesebah and lean. Why not? So we suspend the principle of suffix d'Rabbanan l'kula when it's a davar she'ein bo tircha. That's the first answer of the Ran. Now getting back to our whiteboard, we have Roman numeral number 2, the second answer of the Ran, which is much more complicated. The Ran says the following. If we apply Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula in the case of Hesebah and Daled Kosos, then Nimtzenu Okrim Mitzvahs Hesebah B'Yayin L'Gamre. You'll end up with zero Hesebah because you can apply it to the first two Kosos and say, all right, we don't need Hesebah. We can apply it to the second two Kosos. We don't need Hesebah. Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula. And you end up without any Hesebah on any of the Daled Kosos. You've effectually undermined the entire enterprise of Hesebah with regard to Daled Kosos. And in such a case, we don't apply Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula. When the Rabbanan established a mitzvah, and even though it's a mitzvah D'Rabbanan, you cannot apply Safek L'Kula in a way that will completely dissolve and undermine the mitzvah. There's a mitzvah of Shtiyas Daled Kosos B'Hesebah, and you cannot forfeit that mitzvah by applying Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula when you're being oker the entire takana, the entire mitzvah of Hesebah. Okay. Now, eventually, what we're going to try to study is an nafkamina between the two answers of the Ran. But before we get to that, we want to introduce the kasha of the Mishnah Lamel. The Mishnah Lamel finds a contradiction in the words of the Ran. There's a Ran in Psachim, which is what we summarize now, and there's a Ran in Masechta Megillah, in his commentary on the Rif at the beginning of Masechta Megillah. The Gemara establishes in Megillah, as we all know, that Kriyas HaMegillah divides into two. The Prazim will read the Megillah on the 14th and the Mukafim on the 15th. What do we do with a city? And we're not sure if it's Mukaf or not, because Mukafim means from the time of Yoshua. We have a city, and so many centuries and millennia have passed by. We don't know if this city was walled back in the time of Yoshua. So what do we do now? Should we read the Megillah on the 14th? Should we read the Megillah on the 15th? We have a suffix. So the Ran writes in the name of the Gaonim that any city that has a suffix, whether it's walled or not, then Azlinan Basa Ruba. We look at Rove cities. Now, since Rove, most of the cities are not walled, certainly not from the time of Yoshua, therefore, any city that's in a suffix will apply the Achra of Rove, and therefore will read the Megillah on the 14th rather than the 15th. But then the Ran adds another point. He says, even if you would convince me, which I don't know if anybody could, that it's a Safek HaShakol, that 50% of the cities are walled. Maybe he means within a certain area, maybe in Eretz Yisrael, I don't know what he means. But he says, V'afilu tim salomar, even if you'll argue against my answer, that the issue of Mukefes Choma Mimos Yoshua is a Safek HaShakul. Nevertheless, my conclusion is that they should be reading the Megillah in such an unknown city, undefined city, on the 14th. Why? He says, oh, maybe I'll add just one point. And why would you call it a Safek HaShakul? Again, I guess he's sensitive to the issue that, cities that are walled are not so common, they're kind of rare. He says because, again, I'm not going to get into this now because this is an hour-long shir. He says because the issue in a city is called kavua. And we have a principle called kol kavua kemechzal mechzal. Okay, I just having said it and blurted it out, now we go on. He says I would still have the city read on the 14th, even though it's a Safek HaShakul. Why? He says the following. Kevan shesafek d'Rabbanan usafek d'Rabbanan lekula, the issue of when to read the Megillah on the 14th or the 15th is safek d'Rabbanan. And we have a principle, safek d'Rabbanan lekula. is lefia klal hazeh yesh lanu liftar es ori asfekos shelo yikru bahen klal. Why? Because on every day, let's say the 14th, well, I'm going to say Safek Darban Lakula. Maybe it's a walled city. And when I get to the 15th, I'm going to say Safek Darban Lakula. Maybe it's an unwalled city. Should have read on the 14th. He says, in that case, this city will not have a day for Kriyas HaMegillah. So by applying Safek Darban Lakula, we're going to be Oker the mitzvah completely. Sounds very similar so far to the Ran in Psachim, who says that if you do away with Hesebah in all the kosos, the first two, the second two, and apply Safek Darban Lakula, you have effectually undermined and neutralized the entire enterprise of Hesebah. Here also, you're undermining the entire enterprise of Kriyas HaMegillah for a city that's specific. So what's the Ran's conclusion? What do we do with this city? They're going to read on the 14th. Why on the 14th? He says, because we have to establish one day out of the two, otherwise we're being oker the mitzvah Megillah in Gansen completely. Is tiknu shetekef shebal lehem is damnus rishon l'kayim ha-mitzvah v'hi b'yudalid b'adar yikayim ha-mitzvah. He says that we know for sure that on one of these 2 days, 14 or 15, they're going to have to read the Megillah, because otherwise you're being okay the mitzvah completely from that city. So then it becomes first come, first serve. Or maybe you want to call it mitzvah bal yadcha al tach mitzena. That when we hit the 14th, that's the first opportunity for the reading of the Megillah in that city. That's when they'll read the Megillah. Says the Mishnah Lamelech, here lies a stira in the Ran. Because as far as the Ran in Megillah is concerned, because of this suffix, we're going to pick up the first mitzvah, which is Yudalit, the first opportunity. We look at the at the calendar, and there are 2 possible days on which we can read the Megillah. We do the first of the 2. That's on the 14th. Joe, are you what happened to you, Joe? Oh, you're still there. Okay, I thought we lost you. Says the Mishnah Melech, let's go back to the Ran in Psachim as far as Hesebah is concerned. We have a possibility that Hesebah is a requirement in the first 2 kosos or in the last 2 kosos. And the Ran's second answer is that we cannot apply Safek Darban Lakula because we're going to be oker the mitzvah Hesebah in Gansen. So according to the Ran and Megillah, then, when should we be doing Hesebah? During the first 2 kosos. The first 2 kosos parallel the 14th of Adar for Megillah reading. Second, parallel the 15th of Adar for Megillah reading. And basically, according to the logic and the principle of the Ran in Megillah, we choose the first of the 2. We look at the calendar, at the sequential sequence, and we take the first. If that be the case, then in Dalit Kosos, we don't know whether we need the first 2 Kosos Hesebah or the last 2 Kosos Hesebah. So we're going to pick up the first 2 Kosos because that's our first opportunity to fulfill the mitzvah of Hesebah. The Ran says we cannot apply, neither in the case of a city that's Safek Mukafis Choma, nor in the case of Hesebah B'Dalit Kosos, the principle of Safek Darban Lakula. We have no choice but to suspend the principle of Safek Darban Lakula. So which way should we go? We have 2 opportunities. Take the first opportunity, says the Ran in Megillah. But the Ran in Psachim says, no, since we have a principle that we cannot be oker the mitzvah of Hesebah in Gansen, and let's do Hesebah on all 4 kosos. Why in all 4 kosos? According to Ran's first answer, it's very good. It's glatt, because it's not a tircha to ask you to recline, so we'll ask you to recline in all 4 kosos. But according to the second answer of the Ran, then when the principle of Safek Darban Lakula, when applied, it leads you to a brick wall in which you have to be oker the mitzvah completely. In that case, we take the first opportunity in order to fulfill the mitzvah. Even though, again, keep in mind, when we get to this city that's in a suffix, and we read the Megillah on the 14th, it's quite possible, nobody denies this, that city was walled at the time of Yoshua ben Nun and requires a reading of Megillah on the 15th. We're not going to read it on the 15th. Why? Because we're going to apply suffix Rabbanan L'Kula as long as we can still salvage the mitzvah. How do we salvage the mitzvah? By reading the Megillah on the 14th.
And no bracha?
According to the Ran, you would make a bracha on the 14th. Why? Because since the halacha is in mechza al mechza that we impose the reading of the Megillah on the first opportunity, that's a chiyuv with a bracha. It's not a suffix. We are no longer applying suffix to Rabbanan L'Kula. But in effect, you have to know, so what do? You're not applying suffix to Rabbanan L'Kula. So we have a rule that for such cities that are in suffix, we're machayev them to read the Megillah on the 14th. Because that's the first opportunity. That's a chiyuv b'toras vadai. So they start with a suffix, but the machayev is vadai. And if we apply the same yardstick to Dalid Kosos with regard to Hesebah, says the Mishnah Melech, you should require Hesebah on the first two Kosos. That's the mitzvah that comes first. As far as the other two Kosos, is suffix Rabbanan L'Kula. So herein lies what seems apparently on the surface to be a stira between the two Rans. And the Mishnah Melech is going to dedicate an entire section. If you know a little bit about the Mishnah Melech style, he's very wordy. You know, sometimes you can turn pages and pages in the Rambam that are just Mishnah Melech pages. And he's going to try to reconcile this apparent contradiction in the Ran. Now, what I find a little bit challenging about the Mishnah Melech's answer is that he seems to be using two different variables and combining them somehow. So I'm going to take a little bit of poetic license here, and I'm going to focus on one of the two variables, because I think that makes life a lot easier. Afterwards, we'll try to see if we can integrate the second variable of the Mishnah Melech. The Mishnah Melech says that there are two categories of suffix. There's a category of suffix which is for the entire Klal Yisrael. There's another category of suffix which is for a segment of Klal Yisrael. And the difference is very fundamental, because if the suffix is for the entire Klal Yisrael, then by applying suffix to Rabbanan L'Kula, you will undermine the mitzvah for the entire Klal Yisrael. And that would be the case of Dalid Kosos. If you are paskening based on suffix to Rabbanan L'Kula that neither the first two nor the last two generate a chiyuv of Hesebah, you have, in effect, as we said over and over again, undermined and completely done away with the entire mitzvah for all of Klal Yisrael. Masha Einkein, in the case of Megillah, all of Klal Yisrael is very well settled and very understood. You know, it's understood and they're categorized. It's either a Yudalid for Prazos or a Tesvav for Mekafes Choma. You've got this particular city. If I could use the word zoom, we'll zoom in on that city. And that city is a suffix. If we apply suffix Rabbanan L'Kula to that city, we're not going to be oker the mitzvah of Megillah for the entire Klal Yisrael. You'll have a segment of Klal Yisrael, let's say a well-defined city, and there they will not have the opportunity to fulfill the mitzvah. Let them back out and find a different city for Purim. So he says the following. He says, Sveikos ha'elu, meaning Megillah on the one hand, and Dalid Kosos Hesebah on the other hand, Einom domim zelazeh. They're not similar. Hasafek bi'arba Kosos, who suffik l'klal Yisrael. Our Safek le'inyan Megillah ba'ayoros Mesupakos b'choma. Eno Safek al Klal Yisrael. Ela Safek li'yechidim. Again, it's a little bit odd to call it Yechidim. It's an entire city. But relative to the entire Klal Yisrael, we could call it Yechidim. He says the following. Therefore, Hesebah shas sofek ula klal Yisrael v'imnekel v'nomar sofek l'kula, which means both with regard to the shti of the first two kosos and the shti of the last two kosos. Then he says, Nimtza nekra takonis chachamim mikol v'chol v'af echad v'Yisrael lo yesev. There won't be one Jew who'll do a Hesebah, because we're going to apply something to Rabbanan L'Kula to the first two kosos, and likewise to the second two. You've completely eradicated Hesebah for Dalet kosos for every last Jew on the face of the earth. Even Horton, who hears a who, will not do Hesebah. Said Nekra takonis chachamim l'klal Yisrael. Al kain. Hichmiru Chachamim. Chachamim decided, forget about Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula. We cannot apply Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula, because if we do, then applying that rule would mean that we're okay the entire mitzvah of Hesebah for all of Klal Yisrael. And therefore, Hichmiru Chachamim sheyesru, right? They should do Hesebah b'chol arba kosos. Masha ein kein kriyas habegila. By Yoras Hamasupakos, he says, Im nomar shekol hayoros hamasupakos yikru biyudalit ubetesvav lo yikru mishum safek rabban lekula takones chachamim leklal Yisrael bimkoma omedes. It's on page 161. Anyone's following this? Why? Because prosim korim b'yudalit, mukafim korim b'tesvav, and whatever the Sveikos will do, whether they'll read it on Yudalit or Tesvav, a no go ras for kereses hatakona. It's not going to be like kereses hatakona. And therefore, in such a case, where we want to give the Safek cities an opportunity for the mitzvah of Megillah, the Ran says, that's the first opportunity. And what the Ran is saying here is that there are two ways of understanding Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula in this context. In a context where if we apply it over and over again, we'll just be okay the mitzvah. In one case, we have to suspend the entire operation and the application of Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula, because otherwise, Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula stands as like with a gun and completely destroys and undermines the entire takana. Like, for example, Hesebah. No one on the face of the earth will have the mitzvah. But when we're dealing with Vadai here and these cities, we'll read it on Yudalit, and these cities certainly on Tesvav, and now we have the Safek, then no matter what you paskin on the Safek, you're not going to be okay the mitzvah completely. So here's a different halacha. Here the halacha is that we're going to deal with this city as a separate entity. We will apply Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula. We don't want to give them a situation where they won't have the mitzvah of Megillah at all. So we'll apply the din of Pogea Botchila, and they will read the Megillah on the 14th. But that has nothing to do with Dalet Kosos, because Dalet Kosos means that there won't be any kiyum mitzvah whatsoever of Hesebah Dalet Kosos if you apply Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula. Hence, we throw out Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula. And we're going to be machriya the Safek both for the first two Kosos and for the second two Kosos L'Chumra, and hence requiring Hesebah in all four Kosos. That's the best I can do in the Mishnah Melech. Okay. Now we have the question, is there enough Gemina going back to the Ran and Psachim between Roman numeral number 1 and Roman numeral number 2? What is the nafkamina? So before we get to the answer that the Hegyonei Halacha wants to present, I would just like to move backwards one step and try to analyze the answer number 1 of the Mishnah Melech, of the Ran, and then answer number 2. The Ran, in his first answer, will suspend the operation of Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula because it's Ein Bo Tircha. To require that he recline is Nishkeferla. I would like to suggest the following, that in the Ran's first answer, he is really applying Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula. But there's a din, which I call nihug l'maisa. In other words, how do you act or perform mitzvahs in reality, in the final analysis? Here we're going to say that we have a chumrah that in a davar she'ein bo tircha, you should ignore Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula. You should imagine as if there was no din of Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula. So in the first answer, the Ran, fundamentally, we are applying Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula. But you know what? Why not, without any tircha, guarantee yourself an extra mitzvah? You get extra brownie points here. So you'll do a Hesebah on all 4 kosos, even though Mikra Din, we could be machriya the Safek L'Kula. But you know what? I don't think it's such an imposition. In the second answer of the Ran, we're doing away totally with Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula. We're not asking you to be machmir. What we're saying is that applying Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula to Hesebah and Daled Kosos will be oker in dancing the mitzvah of Hesebah with regard to Daled Kosos, and that we can't do. So that when the Rabbanan made the takana of Daled Kosos, they organized it in such a way that it should not be a victim of Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula. They completely suspended the operation of Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula with regard to a mitzvah which would be nekra al yidei Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula. And the perfect example is Tveria. Again, Tveria is a suffix, whether it was Mukafes Choma, Mimos Yoshua, etc., etc. And therefore, there is no application of Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula, because otherwise Tveria would end up without any Kriyas HaMegillah. Now, it's interesting, and I never understood why this is so, but in Tveria, they read the Megillah on both the 14th and the 15th. That's not the Ran. The Ran in Megillah says that when we cannot apply Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula, because it's Nekra Takana, so we take Bezeshe Pogeh Bo Tchila. And therefore, Tveria should be reading on the 14th. So if you ask me again, Bobby, when would they make a bracha? No doubt that in Tveria they'll make a bracha on the first day and not on the second. There are parts of Yerushalayim that, at least in the past, were compared to Tveria, but that has to do with another concept called Samach V'Nireh, but we don't know whether they read on the 14th or 15th, Ramot, and Mevaser Tzion, and parts of Givat, many different areas. And Lamaisa, they read it on 2 days. Or they used to in the old days. I think there are still few people around that still read it on both days in those areas that were once a suffix. I mean, now Yerushalayim, Baruch Hashem, is spread out, so even those areas are Samach V'Nireh. Okay. So now comes along our good friend, Rabbi Mirsky, Rabbi Yitzchak Mirsky, and he wants to know what happens if a person drank the Daled Kosos without Hesebah. He's in what, shall we say, a b'diavad situation, post-fact. Does he have to drink the Daled Kosos again and do it right this time with Hesebah? Or do we say, no, b'diavad, he drank the Daled Kosos, all right, he didn't do Hesebah, we'll let him get away with it. Says Hegyonei Halacha, this depends upon the two answers in the Ran. According to the first answer of the Ran, we're on page 162 now, for those who want to follow. He says that because Hesebah, in and of itself, Hesebah, I'm not talking about the shtia now, just the Hesebah, the Maisa Hesebah is Davar Shein Bo Tircha. We're going to be Machmir, and we're going to ask him to do Hesebah on all four. But that's only a chumrah. And therefore, he says that with the Evid, we don't have to be mach. And we'll rely on the din of Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula, the Eino Tzarech Lachzar V'Lishtos B'Hesebah. So according to the first answer, no need to do a repeat performance. I know everybody here is sighing a sigh of relief, because you imagine drinking. Honestly, I hardly survived 4 kosos. I mean, those who drink grape juice, it's Tovel and Bracha. You know, I wish I could drink grape juice, but you know, I just I'm too much of a brisker to. The Rashbam says that there's got to be an alcoholic, intoxication. Again, don't publicize that in your parts, because I know drinking is a whole thing. But be that as it may, to make me drink another 4 kosos the second time around, that's really asking much. So we're sighing a sigh of relief.
But why not at least 2?
Again, he's saying that this entire requirement of Hesebah, after applying Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula, is only a Hiddur mitzvah. It's like a chumrah. So L'chatchila will ask you to drink it with Hesebah, but really, Mikra, then you don't have to drink the Hesebah, because Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula. Any coast that you tell me, I'll apply Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula. So Mikra din, I don't have to drink Hesebah. So now, by the end, you're going to require me to do it again. I'm not sure, honestly, why. I agree 100% with his conclusion. I'm not sure why he has to be so sophisticated about it with Hidur and Chumrah and B'diavad. Forget about all that. I would just say that now it's a tircha to ask him to drink the Daled Kosos again. But he doesn't want to go the simple way. All right, now, according to the second teretz. L'fia teretz hasheni shel Aran, b'safek zeh ein omrim safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula. We will completely suspend the application of Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula in the case of Daled Kosos. L'fi shatakana te'aker b'mkoma legam. The takana of Hesebah will be completely undermined if we apply Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula. Hence, we have to suspend the operation of Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula. Is therefore l'fichach tzarech lachzar v'lishtos b'Hesebah. So again, according to the first teretz in the Rad, it's only a chumrah, the way Rav Mirsky sees it, to require Hesebah. Oh, okay, a chumrah to require Hesebah, you can be machmir l'chatchila, but not b'diavad. Or the way Berzon wanted to say it, it's already a tircha yisera to ask him to drink the valid kosos again. According to the second teretz, there's no Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula. And therefore we have to be machmir both on the first 2 kosos and the last 2 kosos, and Hesebah is a requirement. If it's a requirement per se, then if you omitted it, you're required to repeat performance and do the shtia b'Hesebah and get it right on the second round. Now, I'm not 100% sure of his interpretation of the second answer. It could be that in the Ran's second answer, what we need is to set up a mechanism in which we salvage the takana. We will apply suffix rabbanon l'kula as long as we can say that the takana is still in place. It's omedes al makoma, and we haven't been okir legamre. So it could be for that all you need is el-chatchila. El-chatchila, you're required to drink Hesebah. We've now salvaged the takana. In a b'di'evid situation, we could apply the principle of suffix rabbanon l'kula, even according to the second answer of the Ran. But Rav Mirsky doesn't understand it that way. He understands it that because of this collision, head-on collision between suffix rabbanon l'kula and the takana of Dalit Kosos, for the sake of Dalit Kosos, we completely trump and remove the principle of suffix rabbanon l'kula. And therefore, it's a suffix l'chumra on each one of the two kosos, the sets of two kosos, or each kos, and therefore we need Hesebah, and even b'di'evid you'd have to repeat and drink it again. But now he has a tshuva from Eretz Tzvi. He doesn't tell you who this is. So if anybody has access to Google, tell me who Eretz Tzvi is. Not Eretz HaTzvi, because that's Rav Shechter, but Eretz Tzvi. The Eretz Tzvi takes upon himself a great challenge. He wants to answer the Mishnah Lamelch's kasha on the Ran, the steer in the Ran, in his own original way, completely ignoring the Mishnah Lamelch's answer. Which, by the way, I would say, as we say here in Israel, kol hakavod, because the Mishnah Lamelch is a little bit of a kvetch. It's a little bit dokak, Yechidim and Klal Yisrael and different types of sfeikas, and do we apply? It's complicated. Now, I don't know what to do here at this point. Oh, David says, Tzvi Frumer. Okay. I'm sure he was a religious Jew if his name was Frumer. Okay. Can you tell me, David, when he lived? Once you're Googling it? I'm assuming he was like 19th century. What?
It's he was born in 1884.
1884. So it's
his first name is Aryeh Tzvi Frumer.
Aryeh Tzvi Frumer. So he's basically 20th century.
Well, he died in Majdanek concentration camp. This is in the article.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry you told me that because I was about to slug him up. But okay, now I have to treat him with great respect, All right. He says the following. We're on page 162. There's a fundamental difference. I still want to have to save some time for Korban Pesach, but okay, fine. We'll see. A fundamental difference between Hesebah in Megillah, between Hesebah in Dalit Kosos and Megillah on Purim. Okay, let me just try to present it to you again. The reading of the text. Maybe we'll do a little bit afterwards because it's very tedious. It's a long, long piece. It stretches all the way to 163. He says the following. In the case of Megillah reading, the obligation is on the person. Again, he doesn't use this language, but in our language, I think we call it a chovas gavra. And in a chovas gavra, if let's say he would read the Megillah in that suffix situation on the 14th, it could very well be that he was not Yotzei his mitzvah, because maybe it's Mikofis Chomer, he's required to read the Megillah on the 15th. When you get to the 15th, he's again in a suffix situation. He can't say, well, I read it yesterday on the 14th. Every day generates its own chiyuv. Again, we don't know which day he's chayav in, but the suffix is chal on each day independently. And therefore, when we get to the second day, we're also going to apply the principle of lahachmir, right? Because what are you going to say? There's no suffix. I read it yesterday on the 14th. Well, maybe you're in a 15th situation. He says, by contrast, the mitzvah of Daled Kosos is a mitzvah in the Guf HaKos. Right? In Megillah, there's no mitzvah in the Guf HaMegillah. There's a mitzvah on the Gavra to read the Megillah. Or to hear the Megillah, whatever you want to say. In Daled Kosos, he defines the mitzvah as the kos has to be drunk. Right? It's a chiyuv chapi the kos, the Guf HaKos. The Rabbanon established that two of the kosos have to be drunk by Hesebah. We don't know which two kosos have to be drunk by Hesebah, the first two or the second. He says, therefore, if he drinks the first two kosos by Hesebah, the last two kosos are still omdos b'safek arishon, because maybe these two kosos require a Hesebah. And if you're going to apply the principle of safek v'rabbanan l'kula to the second set of kosos, then you're going to have to apply the principle of safek v'rabbanan l'kula to the first two kosos, because each set of kosos stands up and yells out, I require shtia b'Hesebah. Again, we don't know which voice to listen to. So in that case, we have to apply the principle that he's got to be machmir on each of the two sets of kosos, because what he did in the first two kosos is not going to help him for the last two kosos. However, when we get back to Megillah, which is a suffix on the Gavra, each individual member of that city has to ask himself, does he belong to the Prazim Yedalid? Does he belong to the Mukafim Tesvav? He says that he faces one suffix, and the suffix is how to classify himself. Does he belong to this group, or does he belong to that group? So the Ran says, that's the way the Eretz Tzvi interprets the Ran, that there's only one suffix when the Gavra is involved, i.e. in the case of Megillah, there's only one suffix. When the Chefza of the Kos is involved, and the person is outside the suffix, so with regard to the Kosos, we have two separate Tzveikos. One suffix on the first two kosos, and the other on the second two kosos. Now, again, before we try to figure this out, is everybody on board here? I mean, just to get the structure here, conceptually, of the Eretz Tzvi, again, let me go over it one more time. With regard to Kosos and Hesebah, there are two separate Sfeikas. each one of the sets of kosos, the first and the second, generate its own suffix. And if you're going to be mason on the first two kosos, you still have the same suffix on the second two kosos. And that's because the suffix is in the kos, in the gufa kos, that has to be drunk by Hesebah. Which ones, we don't know. But each one comes along and says, give me my due. I deserve shtia b'daled kos b'Hesebah. Masha Enkin, in the case of Megillah, at the end of the day, there's only one suffix. Because the issue is on the gaffer. Does he have a chiyuv on the 14th or the 15th? So far, so good. Now we have a conceptual structure. Now we'll see how this will answer the stira in the Ran. He says the following. With regard to the mitzvah of Megillah, which is a mitzvah hamutelas al ha'adam, he doesn't know if he's dwelling in a city of this or that, and therefore whether he has an obligation to read it on this day or that day. Therefore, he's in a situation of suffix. Does he have to read it on Yudalid or Tesvav? If he read it on Yudalid, he has a suffix. Maybe he was already Yotzi Chiyuv. We can apply suffix to Rabban Lakula when we get to the 14th. I'm sorry, when we get to the 15th. And we could say, well, maybe I was Yotze the mitzvah on the 14th. Yeah, but maybe you aren't Yotze. The answer is suffix to Rabban Lakula. So again, we can't be Oker the mitzvah in Gansu and say that, you don't know where you belong, and therefore suffix to Rabban Lakula on the 14th or the 15th, and you have no mitzvah free at all. That we can't say. But what we can say is that once you fulfill the mitzvah on the 14th, under the assumption that you are a prazos, you've now salvaged the mitzvah, so it's not nekro legamre. And when you get to the 15th, you have a right to say, well, maybe I was yotzi already on the 14th, and suffix Rabban Lakula. But he says, I can't allow myself that luxury when I get to Daled Kosos. Why? Because the mitzvah and the suffix in the mitzvah is in the kosos. Ha-suffix huba kosos. Which kosos require a Hesebah? Lachein, gamim shasa shtayim harishonos b'Hesebah. He still has the same equal suffix on the shtayim achronos. The adayin omdos b'suffix. So if you are mechayev him in Hesebah on the first two kosos, you're going to have to be mechayev him in Hesebah on the last two kosos. Because again, they're two different sfekas, and now you have to determine on two independent sfekas whether they lend themselves to the application of the universal principle of suffix or lakula, or they don't. If you suspend the principle of suffix or lakula on the first two kosos, then you have to be even, Stephen. You have to be uniform and fair, and suspend the operation of suffix or lakula on the second two kosos. You can't say suffix Rabban Lakula on the second kosos, because then you're involved in a sphera. You're contradicting yourself. You applied suffix Rabban Lakula in the first two kosos. But in suffix Mukafim, Imkara biyom yudalid, lo tzarich likro b'tesvav, davi suffix Rabban Lakula. Why? Because it's all one suffix. So if it's all one suffix, and you suspended the application of suffix Rabban Lakula, and you required reading the Megillah on the 14th, then when you get to the 15th, you have a right to say, well, maybe I was Yotze on the 14th. and Sofik Rabbanan L'Kula. It's very sophisticated. All right, I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't have. Did I make a mistake here by?
No, but Rav, can I ask?
Just if he died in the Holocaust, then we have to be, Dovos supposed to Dovos Vakever,
Can I ask Rav? It's the question isn't the question on the place? It's not necessarily on the Gavra. Is he not trying to say that the
Right.
Megillah is on the Gavra?
You're right. You could argue against him that maybe the suffix is on the place.
Right.
But he's
So that
saying
would be the
we
same.
we don't determine the place in abstract. The determination of the location and its nature is not a historical question. It's a Lamaisa question as far as Yehovah's Gavra is concerned.
Right.
When are you obligated to read the Megillah? And when do you fulfill that obligation?
Right.
So he's saying the following. We can take the Gavra and we can apply the principle of suffix. What do we do with that suffix? And the suffix is on the Gavra. We're going to say, well, maybe he already fulfilled the mitzvah on the 14th, and suffix Rabbanan L'Kula. So when we get to the 15th, and you're asking the Gavra if he fulfilled the mitzvah, he has a right to say that maybe I did. And he points to the 14th, and he says, well, I already fulfilled it yesterday. And L'Kula on the 2nd then. Ella, what? You're going to be Oker the Mitzvah Ganson? No, you're not going to be Oker the Mitzvah Ganson, because even in that city, he's going to read the Megillah on one of those 2 days. And that's what the Ran means by Pogabo B'Tchila. When he gets to the first day, he has to face this conflict of Akiras HaMitzvah, and therefore he will suspend Sofik Rabbanan L'Kula. When he gets to the second day, it's no longer Akiras HaTakana, because he's read the Megillah. Now it's pure Sofik Rabbanan L'Kula, and he has the right to say, well, I fulfilled my obligation on the first day. But in Kosos, we don't have the luxury of doing so, because the Chiyuv is inherent in the Kos. I mean, in my mind, that's the real question. Again, I don't want to, now that you told me a little bit about
I was going to
I
ask.
don't want to argue against it, but I don't know how he knows that there's a chiyuv klapi the kos, meaning we have a concept called koshel bracha. Koshel bracha is a chiyuv klapi the kos, that you have to do a shti on the kos. But the mitzvah dalid kosos is derech cherus. It's to demonstrate your cherus. That's a chovas gavra. That's not a chov in the kos. You can have a chova vis-a-vis the kos if it's a koshel bracha. I'm not going to deny that the dalid kosos, each one has its own bracha. But the Gemara says that there are 4 kosos, and you have to, in each case, you have to express your derech cherus by doing a Hesebah related to that bracha. So your chiyuv of chayav inishli, I'm getting confused between Purim and Pesach. That's a different adol yod of chayav adam laharos esatzva kilu hu atzma yotzim mitzrayim. So that's your chova to do a Hesebah. I went out of Mitzrayim. I'm a big shot. I'm a ben chori. That's a chova's gavra. And you have to find the place within the Haggadah, in the Sipur Yisrael, where the kiyum of Chayav Adam Liras Esatzvil through Hesebah is fulfilled. So you're going to tell me, well, I already did the Hesebah in the first 2 kosas. That doesn't tell me anything about your Chova's Gavra, because you still have a suffix on the second 2 kosas, as far as your Chiyuv Gavra is concerned. But he's learning that, no. Chiyuv Gavra doesn't apply to Daled Kosos. It's a Chiyuv in the Kos itself. And therefore, if you're going to suspend the operation of Sofik Rabbanan L'Kula in the first 2 Kosos, then you're going to have to do so consistently in the second 2 Kosos. Hence, you're going to have to do a Hesebah on all 4.
I can see where you would say that it's a Chiyuv Gavra, that there's a Chiyuv Cheftza. In other words, there's a Chiyuv Gavra on the Daled Kaisis. That has to be a Chiyuv Gavra. It's your Chiyuv to drink the wine. It's not the Kais. The Kais doesn't have a Chiyuv. Like, it's not the Chiyuv in the Kais. The Chiyuv is your Chiyuv. But within that concept of Dalit Kaises, the Kais brings the Hesebah. In other words, it's the Kais that creates the Hesebah, really.
You remind me of Beit Shammai. Is it Beit Shammai who says that you should start Kiddush? Let me just try to remember this. According to Beit Shammai, you start Kiddush with Kedushas Hayom, Kaddish Shabbos, and then you say Bar Pri Hagaf. Because it's the Shabbos that sets up the Bar Pri Hagaf. There's no independent Bar Pri Hagaf. I mean, as a Birchas HaMitzvah. So here too, there's no independent mitzvah to run around and say Derech Eretz, and wave a flag. The mitzvah is the Shtiyas HaKos, so the Kos is the Gorem for the Cheres Sheyova.
Yeah, so you don't have to go so far. I didn't see his language, but you don't have to go so far as to say that he says that it's a chiyuv chefetz on the kais. It's still a chiyuv gavra, but the kais is what is giving you that din hesebah. So therefore, every time you drink the kais, you have the same suffix, really.
Right. You can't separate and say, well, I did it that way, I did it that way. Each kos is going to demand hesebah. It's an opportunity to do hesebah. And the halacha is, the takana was, that whenever you have that opportunity, then you have to fulfill that opportunity. We don't know exactly what opportunity it is. Is it the shtia, the first two, or the second two? But don't tell me, well, I already potted up my chiyuv with the first two, and now it's a suffix rabbanan. You can't do that because the entire Dalit Kosa says in one entity, it's one package, and you have to be consistent. You can't start splitting it up and say, well, yeah, I did it then. That's okay.
I mean, even though we do Hesebah for the whole Seder, so it's like that's, but, so really,
So that actually is his discussion here on page 163. Okay, well, just, again, we don't have that much time, but just to, by the way, regards from a lady who just landed and came here to our house. She's a few feet away from us here. My Shviga, my mother-in-law, so sein gesund. I mean, I'm telling you, it's Nisim v'neflos. I can't tell it. I was able to help her with her suitcase a little bit, but it's really exciting. I mean, and all of you mispalalim, and I know everyone had her in mind. I mean, I have to thank you because I don't know if it's one person's philo or everyone's philos, but it's amazing. So on page 163, he has a chakir in the name of the Brisker Rav. And he wants to know the following. What is the definition of Hesebah on this night? Is it a mitzvah unto itself? Or it's part of the mitzvah of, let's say, Achilas Matzah, of Shtiyas Dalit Kosos? And the Brisker Rav wants to develop a nafkamina and a machlokas rishonim on this very esoteric point of this issue. He says that if you look in the Rambam, and this is what Bobby was intimating before, there's Hesebah during the entire meal. And the Rambam writes, Ubishar achilaso, ushtiyaso, im hesiv, harezeh meshubah. Again, I try it every night, every Seder, but it's very hard to eat the entire meal best Seder. But anyway, that's the Rambam's recommendation, that the entire meal is Hesebah. If that be the case, then clearly, says the Brisker Rav, the mitzvah of Hesebah is independent of the mitzvah of matzah, the mitzvah of Shtiyas Dalit Kosos, because you could argue, and he's going to try to claim that that's Russia's opinion, that Hesebah is built into the mitzvah of Dalit Kosos, and it's an integral part of the mitzvah of Dalit Kosos, and it's likewise an integral part of the mitzvah of Achilas Matzah. Again, all that Rabbanan, but nevertheless, but to say that and then apply Hesebah to the entire meal, that makes no sense at all. And the Brisker Rav is going to try to prove from another Rambam that the Rambam is l'shitaso, that the mitzvah of Hesebah is a separate mitzvah unto itself. Chayev Adam Laharos Es Atzmo. And again, exactly how to fulfill the Chayev Adam Laharos Es Atzmo, the details and the requirements, that's where the Rabbanan fill in the blanks. And they require you to fulfill that separate independent mitzvah of Chayev Adam Laharos Es Atzmo during Shtiyas Kosos and during Achilas Matzah. And that's the chiyuv. As far as the rest of the meal, it's a kiyuv mitzvah without a chiyuv and tavel of bracha. But it's a separate independent mitzvah. So you have a mitzvah of daled kosos and a mitzvah of hesebah. You have a mitzvah of matzah and a mitzvah of hesebah. The Rosh, on the other hand, writes, Im ochal kezayis matzah below hesebah, lo yotza. And the Brisker Rav understands that lo yotza means lo yotza yedei chovas matzah, which means, we're on page 164, if anyone's following, that hesebah is built into the mitzvah of matzah. Again, all the Rabbanan, but the Rabbanan injected hesebah into the very fabric of the mitzvah achilas matzah. And if you eat the matzah without hesebah, again, this is a scary psak of the Rosh, you haven't fulfilled your mitzvah of matzah. Now, I know Bobby's going to ask me, should I repeat the bracha again? But leave out the bracha for me. Just let's focus on this. But according to the Rambam, says the Brisker Rav, that Hesebah is a separate independent chiyuv and a mitzvah that emanates and is generated by Chayev Adam L'Irsus Atzmo, just the occasion to fulfill that chova is Shtiyas Daled Kosos Matzah, then you would not have to eat the matzah again if you did it without a Hesebah, or the Shtiyas Daled Kosos again, because you were yotzei the mitzvah of matzah, the mitzvah of Daled Kosos. Now again, I wonder, according to Brisker Rav, in the Rambam Shita, could I and should I perhaps eat the matzah again, Hesebah, without a bracha, just to find an opportunity to fulfill the mitzvah of Hesebah as a separate independent chiyuv? But it could be that would be like char sudaso. It'd be like, when he eats his kremsluch, I don't know what he's eating there, and he does it Hesebah, so he gets a kiyum of Chayev Adam L'Irsus Atzmo. But it's not at all connected to the matzah. And you haven't fulfilled the takana of Hesebah b'shas achilas matzah, but that has no impact on the mitzvah of achilas matzah, because it remains independent of the mitzvah of achilas matzah. The Rosh, on the other hand, seems to assume, again, I don't know, you could say that the Rosh, when he says, Achal kazayis matzah below Hesebah lo yatza, means he didn't fulfill his mitzvah of Hesebah. But I don't think that's pshat. And the Brisker Rav certainly rejects that, because he's talking about a kazayis matzah. So he's, once he uses the term kazayis matzah, he's talking about the mitzvah ba'erev tochlu matzahs. And the Rabbanan required that ba'erev tochlu matzahs is achilas matzah b'Hesebah. And he forfeited that. He's got to eat the matzah again. And when he eats the matzah again, he's fulfilling the mitzvah of matzah, or at least that dimension of the mitzvah of matzah that the Rabbanan established as integral to matzah, and it's part of the mitzvah of matzah. And then he says that there's another Rambam that we should add to this thing. Where's the other Rambam? One second. I don't have a Rambam in front of me. That's my problem. I'm just looking. Okay, well, we're going to have to read the Rambam inside, but just because we're pressed for time, there are 4 extra words in the Rambam. The Rambam writes, "V'im lav eino tzar." So I'm now on page 164, and he's interpreting "V'im lav eino tzarich" in the Rambam as addressing the case of the Rosh where he ate the matzah or he drank the daled kosos without a Hesebah, The Rosh says tzarech lachzor l'kayim b'Hesebah, and the Rambam says v'im lav, if he didn't do a Hesebah, eino tzarech. So he's interpreting the Rambam in the light of the Brisker Rav that eino tzarech means he doesn't have to eat the matzah again a second time. Right the Rambam writes, "V'sharach hiloso." First, the Rambam establishes that you do a Hesebah during Dalakos and Achis Matzah. Then the Rambam says, "V'sharach hiloso ushtioso im hesiv hareza meshubach." And then the Rambam writes, "V'im lav," meaning if he didn't do a Hesebah, eino tzarech. So we thought that the Rambam is going on the last statement, the Seifa, namely that a reason meshubach if he does Hesebah during the rest of the meal, but in lav eino tzarech, he doesn't have to drive himself crazy. But here's a whole new pshat in which v'im lav eino tzarech is going back to the reish of the Rambam, that if he wants to fulfill the mitzvah of Hesebah, he's got to do so b'shas achilas matzah and shtiyas talid kosas. V'im lav, which means b'di'eved, if he ate the matzah without Hesebah or shtiyas, then eino tzarech. He doesn't have to go back and do it again, like the Rosh says he does. Rabosai, we almost finished Arba Kosos towards the end. The rest of this essay on Daled Kosos, which is, after page 164, 165, 166, and a little bit on 167, that's about 2 pages. That's more hashkafidik. Some of the ideas and the machshavos of the Rishonim and the Abarbanel and others about Yitzias Mitzrayim, and he connects it to Hesebah and to Daled Kosos, fine. But what we didn't get up to, which is a little bit chaval, it's my fault, but he has an entire chapter here called Karban HaGeula, about the Karban Pesach. And he does a fantastic piece of research here, which we don't have time for now, in which he tries to show you that every single halacha and requirement in Karban Pesach, and there's so many unique requirements in halachas in Karban Pesach, each one of them, and he goes through them one by one, are a reflection of the essence of the Karban as a Karban HaGeula, to indicate that we are now cutting ourselves off from the Avodah Zarah of Mitzrayim. And he ties all the different knots of halacha, all the different pishivkas, the nuances of requirements of halachas and Karban Pesach, and shows how consistently every one of them is there to publicize that we are now free of the Avodah Zarah of Mitzrayim, of the Tleh, which was worshipped as a deity by Mitzrayim. And he explains why they worshipped it as a deity, and why the Jews were influenced by that, and how the Karban Pesach was meant, lafuke, to uproot this belief of the animal, the tleh being an avodah zarah. So it's a pretty fantastic piece of research. I don't think we're going to get to it today. That's for sure not. But you have it, and
what about next week? What do we got time next?
Right. So next week, let me just say one thing about next week. I'm just going to pause this for a minute.